Welcome, one and all, sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, to another one of my special wizard tales.
The Emperor's New Clothes. Once upon a time, there was a little boy who lived in a palace. He was just a normal little boy who liked to do all the things that normal little boys do, and his name was Louis. Louis loved to slide down the banisters, and there were lots of banisters in the palace. He loved to swing from the chandeliers and climb down the curtains, and the palace had lots of chandeliers and curtains too. The problem was, Louis was always wrecking his clothes.
Look what you've done! Have you no respect for your clothes? Oh, for goodness sake!
Cried Louis's mother. When his mother wasn't looking, Louis loved to play games with the palace guards. They liked young Louis and taught him lots of fun things. One day, the guards tried to teach Louis how to play hopscotch on the checkered floor in the palace hall. The guards hopped and stopped, then they turned and hopped and stopped some more. When it was Louis's turn, he hopped and he stopped, then he turned and he hopped and fell over. Unfortunately, he fell over just as his mother walked in.
Louis, Louis! Young princes do not play with the palace guards!
She ordered. For that's what Louis was, a prince who would one day become the emperor. Louis knew he couldn't play with the guards, so he snuck into the garden and sat by the palace fountain. He gazed into the water and smiled at the playful fishes. In fact, the fishes seemed to be having more fun than Louis was. Louis leaned further and further over the water until he fell in. Poor Louis's clothes were ruined, and his mother was furious. Again! Louis's mother always managed to spoil his fun. All through his childhood, Louis was told that clothes were the most important thing in his whole life. 10 years passed. Now Louis was a young man, and he still believed that his clothes and his image were the most important things in his life. By now, Louis was in charge of the army, and so he often wore his army uniform. The uniform was dark green and a little drab, and Louis's mother just hated it.
Louis, how could you? You look like a common soldier. So drab,
she whined. So Louis designed a beautiful new uniform for himself, and for the whole army as well. It was a beautiful deep blue colour and covered with gold braid. The uniform was completed with a splendid blue hat topped with a large feather. But even though he looked magnificent, Louis was never really happy. Many years passed, and Louis did become the emperor. He still dressed in very fancy clothes, but he was fat and unhappy. Louis's mother was still alive, and even though she was very old, she would still complain about his clothes. To escape his nagging mother, Louis snuck out to his favourite place, the fountain in the garden. He sat there sadly peering into the water.
Yes, Mamma, no, Mamma. Who'd think I was the emperor? I should be able to wear anything I like,
he said to himself. Suddenly, a ball hit Emperor Louis on the head. As he leaned down to pick it up, a little puppy grabbed at the ball too. The emperor loved dogs, so he was happy to have a tug of war over the ball. But Louis was very surprised when a young girl started calling his name. "Louis! Louis!" she cried. It was Antoinette, the head gardener's granddaughter, and she was calling her puppy, for his name was also Louis. The emperor told Antoinette He first thought the head gardener was a beggar because his clothes were so shabby. But then the young girl surprised him.
My grandpapa taught me that it's the amount of goodness in your heart that's really important, not clothes,
she stated. The emperor and the little girl sat by the fountain and talked. Antoinette told Louis of how much his people loved him because he was kind and generous. The emperor was very pleased to hear this because he felt that nobody really loved him. Emperor Louis told Antoinette of his plans for a grand party to celebrate his birthday. He couldn't wait to show everybody his new clothes. When Antoinette asked the emperor what his new clothes looked like, he replied,
Well, I don't really know. I haven't ordered them yet.
That's when Antoinette came up with a great idea. She suggested that the emperor hold a competition to decide who would design his new clothes. Louis loved this plan. He decided to offer a grand prize for the winning clothes. And so, the competition was announced throughout the world.
1,000 gold ducats to whoever shall make the emperor the finest suit of clothes for the occasion of his birthday,
proclaimed the town crier. The quest for the emperor's new clothes had begun. People from all over the world started making garments for Emperor Louis, each of them intent on winning the 1,000 gold ducats. In Scotland, they designed a special kilt for the emperor. In Germany, they made beautiful lederhosen. In Bali, they wove a sarong from golden threads. And in India, they embroidered diamonds into a kurta. In every country, every tailor was doing his best to win the money. But not everybody who heard about the competition was honest. Moshe and Serge were always on the lookout for ways of making money, honestly or dishonestly, and usually it was dishonestly. So when they read about the competition on a sign on the palace gates, they could see an opportunity.
What say we go into the tailoring business,
said Serge with an evil grin. Moshe nodded his head eagerly. Neither of them knew anything about making clothes, but they both knew a lot about being crooks. So the two ratbags marched into the palace. Although he was really fat, Louis didn't like people to mention it. In fact, the emperor preferred people to flatter him and tell him what a fine physique he had. Even the prime minister had grown used to always complimenting the emperor. So when Serge and Moshe measured the emperor for his new clothes, they lied about what his measurements really were.
There you are, Your Majesty. A perfectly trim 36.
Fibbed Serge. The foolish emperor actually believed what Serge and Moshe said. So when they mentioned the special magic cloth they were going to use for the emperor's new clothes, Louis was very interested indeed.
Tell me more. It sounds exactly what I need,
exclaimed the emperor. They told him that the cloth was woven from threads of the finest gold and silver and was extraordinarily beautiful. But what made the cloth truly magic was that it was only visible to people who were wise and gifted, like the emperor himself. Foolish people could see nothing at all. The emperor liked this idea very much because it meant he would be able to tell who was stupid and who was not. The emperor was so excited about the magic cloth, he gave Moshe and Serge a room in the palace and asked them to start work on it right away. The first thing the two crooks did was to order sacks of gold and silver and diamonds and rubies so they could weave their magic cloth. But of course, Serge and Moshe weren't going to weave anything. They were going to steal the precious metals and stones.
Nothing to it, eh, Serge? Like taking sweets from a baby,
chortled Moshe as he and Serge carried the sacks of treasure into their room inside the palace. The Emperor was thrilled to be getting a new suit made of magic cloth. He couldn't wait to tell everyone. First, he burst in on his ancient mother.
Mother, I've got the most stupendous news!
Cried the excited Emperor. But Louis's mother was playing cards and told him to go away. Next, Louis tried to tell one of the palace guards about his new suit, but the guard was on duty and not allowed to talk. Nobody seemed to care about his new suit. So Louis went to his favourite place. Sitting by the fountain in the garden, he was delighted to find young Antoinette and Louis the dog. The Emperor Louis told the little girl about his new suit, and she was very interested. Moshe and Serge worked at their loom, pretending to weave the cloth that no one could see.
A little more invisible thread in that seam, don't you think, Moshe?
Crowed Serge. The Emperor's birthday was approaching, and he was most concerned that his tailors would not complete his magic suit in time. So he asked the Prime Minister to check on its progress. When the Prime Minister went to Serge and Moshe's room, he was amazed at what he saw. Absolutely nothing! Serge pretended to hold up a jacket, but the Prime Minister couldn't see anything at all. However, the Prime Minister did know the magic cloth was supposed to be invisible to foolish people. And he didn't want to seem foolish, so he told Serge the jacket looked magnificent. The Prime Minister reported back to Emperor Louis. He couldn't tell the Emperor that there was no jacket, because that would mean he must be foolish. So he lied.
The new garments are beyond description, sire. Even more astounding than you can imagine,
announced the Prime Minister. Louis was thrilled. When the Prime Minister reported that Serge and Moshe had used up almost all of the precious metals and jewels in the palace, Louis didn't care. He ordered that they could have as much gold and as many jewels as they liked. Emperor Louis wanted his birthday suit to be the best ever made. So, even more sacks of gold, silver and jewels were delivered to Moshe and Serge's room in the palace. The two crooks could barely believe their eyes. Mountains of treasure surrounded them.
We're rich! Rich!
They cried. But just then, they heard the town crier make an announcement outside the palace. The Emperor had proclaimed a public holiday in honor of his birthday. Well, this didn't worry the crooks too much, but the next announcement did. The Emperor was going to parade through the town wearing his new clothes. But Serge and Moshe knew that there were no clothes. What could they do? They could keep on lying. And that's exactly what they did do. Day and night, Serge and Moshe pretended to weave and cut and sew the invisible suit. When the Prime Minister next checked on their progress, they showed him the finished jacket, which was really nothing more than an empty coat hanger.
The amount of gold and silver and jewels used in this jacket are worth a fortune alone,
crowed Moshe. Even though he had seen nothing, the Prime Minister once again reported to the Emperor of his beautiful, precious, magical jacket. Louis was worried somebody would try and steal his marvellous clothes, so he ordered guards be placed outside Serge and Moshe's room. Meanwhile, the two crooks decided it was time for them to make their escape. They loaded up all the gold and silver and jewels and tiptoed to the door of their room. But when they opened the door, they were shocked to see two enormous guards. The guards had been given their orders.
No one comes in and no one goes out. Order of the Prime Minister,
barked one of the guards. Serge and Moshe quickly retreated back into their room. There was no way out for them, so they decided to continue their bluff. they would convince the emperor himself that the non-existent clothes were real. The day of the emperor's birthday dawned, and excited crowds gathered outside the palace. Everybody was talking about the emperor's new clothes. There were already rumors about how splendid they were, and the fact that they could only be seen by intelligent and cultured people. Inside the palace, Moisha and Serge carefully carried the new clothes to the emperor. Of course, there weren't actually any clothes there at all, but everybody pretended that there were because they wanted to seem clever. Finally, Moisha and Serge presented the clothes to the emperor himself. He couldn't see them either, so he asked the Prime Minister if he could see the suit.
I can see it as well as you can, sire,
stated the Prime Minister. Serge and Moisha continued to praise their wonderful fabric, and neither the Emperor nor the Prime Minister were brave enough to admit that they could see nothing. Emperor Louis was thoroughly confused. He knew he couldn't see any clothes, but if he admitted it, then he would be seen as a fool. And the Emperor should not be seen as a fool. So Louis took a walk in the garden to try and work out what he should do. Maybe he was going blind. But he knew he wasn't blind because he could see his hands. Then the Emperor had a terrible thought.
Mad. That's it. I must be going mad,
he said sadly. The Emperor really wanted to talk to his friend Antoinette, but sadly, the little girl wasn't there. The poor, confused Emperor stood in his bedroom wearing only his underclothes. As the Prime Minister watched, Moisha and Serge proceeded to dress him. First, they put on Emperor Louis's invisible shirt. Then, his invisible pantaloons, his invisible jacket, and finally, his invisible cloak. Even though the Emperor was really still only wearing his underwear, Serge and Moisha pretended he looked splendid.
There, Your Majesty, your new clothes,
lied Serge. Louis then looked in the mirror. All he could see was himself in his underwear, but he didn't dare admit it. Crowds were lining the streets of the city. They couldn't wait to see their emperor in his wonderful new birthday suit.
We want the Emperor! We want the Emperor! We want the Emperor! We want the Emperor!
They chanted. High above the street, sitting in the royal box, was Louis's mother. She was just as excited about her son's new clothes as everyone else. Suddenly, a hush fell over the crowd. The Emperor had arrived. Surrounded by his guards and footmen, Emperor Louis strode down the street, dressed only in his underwear. Nobody knew what to do, and Louis's mother fainted dead away. The only thing the people knew was that if you couldn't see the clothes, you must be a fool. And nobody wanted to be a fool, so they all pretended they could see them. But Emperor Louis knew that something was wrong. He looked around the crowd for someone who would tell him the truth. And finally, he saw his friend Antoinette and her little dog Louis. The Emperor leaned down and asked his friend if she liked his new clothes made of gold and silver and jewels.
Your Majesty, there are no silver threads, or any gold, or jewels. I cannot see any new clothes,
said the honest little girl. The rest of the crowd laughed at Antoinette and mocked her for being a fool who could not see the new clothes. But Emperor Louis realized his friend was being honest.
Wait! She does not lie. There are no clothes. The child is not a fool. I am. I have been the greatest fool of all. A vain fool.
stated the Emperor sadly. But Antoinette still loved the Emperor, as did everyone in the crowd. It didn't matter how fine his clothes were. They all knew that he was a kind, honest man inside. And that's what really counted. Louis was so happy, he led everyone back to the palace for his birthday party. And just as they arrived, they spotted Musha and Serge sneaking out with all the bags of treasure. So, happy Emperor Louis had the two crooks thrown in jail and promised never to worry about his clothes ever again.
Thus another fine wizard tale concludes. Sisters, brothers, fathers, mothers, join me again soon for another classic tale. Won't you?